So, the mad woman in the attic. To what are we referring when we talk about the mad woman in the attic? Yeah, we are indeed talking about Jane Eyre. And here, the mad woman in the attic is Bertha Mason. It's Mr. Rochester, isn't it? Yeah. Keeping his secret in the attic. His wife, who he hasn't divorced. She was from a West Indian planter family, and there was a suggestion that she was part slave, part African. So a dodgy, degenerate character. Actually, Jane Eyre, if you haven't read it, you should do. It's just full of phrenology and physiognomy. It's one of the central kind of motifs that we see being used in this particular novel. But the mad woman, Bertha Mason, kept under control by, is it Grace Pooley? Is that what her name is? Or her nurse. And occasionally when Grace has had a few too many gins, she slips out and causes havoc and eventually burns down Rochester's house and leaves him disfigured. As we'll see, the mad woman in the attic is a kind of metaphor that the feminist historian Elaine Showalter picks up on to describe what she perceives to be the relationship between women and madness. The Showalter thesis is basically this. She argues that there is a special relationship between women and madness. A special relationship that in some degrees is summarised by this image, this painting that we've come back to time and time again. Robert Fleury Thompson's picture of Pinel freeing the mad woman. The picture painted in the 1870s that now hangs in the Salpêtrière as a symbol of all that is good about psychiatry. And Showalter gives a very detailed examination of the meanings of this particular painting, remembering that it was produced in the 1870s to speak to psychiatrists about her identity. In particular, she notes the patriarchal gaze of Pinel as he benignly and fatherly releases the women from their fetters. He notices the submissiveness and the highly sexualized nature of the young women as portrayed in the center of the picture, and those waiting to be free, waiting to benefit from the largesse and the humanity of Pinel. And as you can see here, one of the women that he's just freed is reaching up to kiss his hand. It's a picture that puts the male psychiatrist at the center of a kind of maelstrom of female madness, which he's controlling. So that is emblematic of Showalter's wider argument. We can have a look at a few of the things that she said in The Female Malady about her thesis and the painting. Depicts the insane as mad women of different ages, from youth to senility. Some are crouched in melancholia, others crying out in hysterical fits, while one gratefully kisses the hand of Pinel. The representatives of sanity in the painting are all men, and thus division between feminine madness and masculine rationality is further emphasized by the three figures at the center. In the foreground is a lovely, passive and disheveled young woman, her eyes modestly cast down, upon whose exposed bosom an erect and dignified Pinel gazes with ambiguous interest. The keeper, who holds up her arm while he unlocks her chains, seems less to be releasing her than winding her up like some huge doll. Her nominal freedom, the composition suggests, exists in a complex tension with male control. In Fleury's painting, The irrationality Pinel frees from its fetters is thus visually translated into its most recognizable sign, the beautiful woman whose disordered body and mind are exposed and opposed to the scrutiny of the man who has the authority to unchain her. These dual images of female insanity, madness as one of the wrongs of woman, madness as the essential feminine nature unveiling itself before the scientific male rationality, suggests the two ways that the relationship between women and madness has been perceived. Or, put another way, and this emerges particularly out of Enlightenment thinking, woman's essential nature is constructed as irrational in opposition to what is perceived as an inherent male rationality. We see all of the old dualisms that we know so well, of man being equated with science, woman with nature, man with reason, woman with unreason. Women are constructed in these kind of images, but increasingly from the 18th century onwards, as being more prone to madness. But their experience of madness is gendered within the confines of femininity. She's not saying that men don't go mad. She's saying that by the 18th and 19th century, madness has become something that is specifically associated with women, but also associated with their very nature. In this model, when men go mad, they rave aggressively, brutishly. Women demur. Now, this argument is very powerful, a very powerful expression of the kind of world that produces things like Jane Eyre. And of course, Jane Eyre is not the only literary representation of madness or women within this model that was produced during the Victorian era. We see very much the same things emerging in the novel that I've talked about, Wilkie Collins's Woman in White. But Victorian literature is quite literally littered with these kind of images. Showalter, in recalibrating madness as being something that is associated with women, that is the female malady, rather than the English malady, which is where she got her title from. You'll remember the English malady was the work written by George Chain about English and nervousness, and about how nervousness was the product of a class background, highly sensible and sensitive upper-class people suffering from nervousness. Well, Showalter's saying by the 19th century, what we are seeing is a female malady that directly associates a gender rather than a class with this particular condition. And what's her evidence for this? Because the book isn't just a kind of highly, extremely well-written, articulate, forceful, moving polemic. It also has some evidence backing up her main thesis. Firstly, it is how the alienists, the mad doctors, the psychiatrists theorize the female malady. And then it's the depiction, the representation of women in art and literature, like the mad woman in the attic, like Fleury's painting of Pinel freeing the mad woman. But also, she attempted to provide an empirical basis to her argument. And the empirical basis was the greater number of women that were confined within the asylums during the 19th century. So there's a combination of culture and stats going on there. Breaking down her argument a bit. Later on, a couple of pages on from where we were, she says, women within our dualistic systems of language and representation are typically situated on the side of irrationality, silence, nature, and the body, while men are situated on the side of reason, discourse, culture, and mind. Now, I'll put this image up here. These were figures that were placed at the front of the old Bedlam Hospital, the Bethlehem Hospital, that I think had been made in the late 17th, early 18th century by Colley Kibber. And they depict raving madness. And you can see that the images on these statues that were at the portal, the entrance to Bethlehem, you're admitted into Bedlam and you go under these particular images of madness. And we can see from there that the madness being depicted is a specifically male madness, a raving madness. These images are not women. And that is kind of typical of the late 17th, early 18th century. And what Showalter suggests is that increasingly that image of raving madness, masculine, brute, animal madness, is replaced by a new romantic madness of dear, sweet, mad Jane. This occurring particularly in the Romantic period. Raving madmen are replaced by vulnerable, youthful, beautiful female insanity. And she suggests that in many ways this was a direct result of the institutional feminization of insanity within the context of moral therapy. So what we've got here is a bifurcation in the structure of insanity. On the one hand, we've got that older English malady, the pressure of living in the new Victorian world, which is experienced as a form of nervousness that we looked at earlier. On the other, we have the female malady, where sexuality and the essential nature of women combine to produce a condition that is increasingly associated with women. So let's start having a look in more detail at the processes that are going on. And let's have a look at sex and psychiatry in the Victorian era. If Showalter's thesis is right, and I think there are aspects of it that are correct, it is because of the way that gender was conceived of in the Victorian era. It was because of the norms of manliness and femininity that had become central to Victorian culture that madness could be reconfigured in this particular way. We have to understand gender not just in terms of the way that women are constructed, but also the way that men were constructed as well. And what we see in the early 19th century is a real shift in ideas about men and how they should behave. Prior to the 19th century, men were allowed, particularly for a period from, say, 1700 onwards, to be emotional, to be sensitive, to display sensibility, to be revealed as someone that could be open to nervousness. It was regarded as a sign of good breeding that you should behave in this way. It differentiates yourself from the mass that is below you. It was something that was related to your birth, to your inheritance, to the fact that you were born into the right class. Now, increasingly, from the late 18th century right the way into the 19th century, we begin to see a shift. The reconstruction of the ideals of manliness and what it was meant to be a man. Manliness becomes increasingly associated with a set of characteristics that have very little to do with being born into the aristocracy or the gentry or the right class, but are related to your moral behaviour, your moral worth, and your physical strengths and abilities. Symptomatic of this is a book that is now little read these days. I don't know, has anyone read Tom Brown's School Days? Anyone see the TV, the mini-series that was on TV a couple of years ago. Probably not. Depends if you like ABC Sunday night drama or not. You might have missed it. Tom Brown's School Days is an extraordinary book. It was a real sensation when it was published, I think in 1858. Tom Brown, the central character, was born into a sort of a lower gentry family. As a young lad, he liked nothing better than fighting with the local youth, going out, killing animals, generally behaving like a ruffian, but a good-natured ruffian as well. And his father's a bit worried about this and decides that he should be sent away to be educated into a proper, upstanding Christian gentleman. And the course that he takes for doing this is sending him off to Rugby School, which is one of the epitomes of the English, as we call them in England, public schools. You would refer to them as private schools. I know it's a bit confusing, but there you go. Our public schools are private schools, not, they're fee-paying. Rugby had been taken over by the redoubtable Dr. Arnold, who was a grand, upstanding Christian gentleman, who regarded it as his duty to instill in his young charges a certain set of moral values associated with Christianity, but also with health. If there is a motto of this movement of manliness, it's mens sano, incorpore sano. Translate Meg. Where have you seen this before? This motto. That is a healthy mind and a healthy body. Have you seen it around anywhere? No? You have? Where have you seen it? Yes, it is indeed the motto of Carlton Football Club. No coincidence. So, Carlton, 1864? 1864, Carlton Football Club. One of the oldest football clubs in the world, along with Melbourne. And that's all football. No, all football, not just Australian. It's all football. They set up Carlton Football Club. They think, what are we going to have for a motto? A healthy mind and a healthy body. They didn't choose this randomly. They chose it because football was regarded as one of the principal means of instilling manliness, of instilling courage, of developing that healthy body and that healthy mind in tandem. The mid-19th century was the great era of something called philathleticism, the love of athletics. And it was a love based on the idea that to be mentally healthy, you needed to be physically fit. But body and mind would work together. Not only that, you had to be a moral individual. So a healthy body, moral mind, working together to transform the world. Nothing about birth, all about the ability to be shaped as this kind of individual. And Tom Brown, in the course of the book, was duly transformed into the Christian gentleman, playing rugby at rugby. That's why it's called rugby. Playing rugby at rugby, playing cricket as well, realizing that he had a duty to his God and his empire and his society to serve as a strong-minded, upstanding Christian gentleman. And that was the dominant norm of manliness during this period. And as I say, sport was absolutely critical to it. Now, this was part and parcel of a wider development of what has been described as the separate spheres. The separate spheres where women were in control of the domestic realm, where men were in control of the public world. Women's behaviour was private, men's behaviour was public. Women were there to look after the family and the morality of the family within the home. Men were to stride the world of clubs and politics and work, reshaping it under the banner of manliness. So we see femininity, the domestic self. Now, this was challenged on a number of levels. You know, like all discourses, like all ideas, these things never go unchallenged. There were always people standing up and saying, no, this isn't the way we should be looking at the world. This isn't the way that the world works. Increasingly, we begin to see a new form of feminism emerging that insists that women have the same capacities as men to act, have the same abilities of mind. Things like cycling, the emergence of the bicycle in the 1890s, became a major battleground over these issues, and they related both to the norms of masculinity and femininity and to the way that the mind was constructed in the body and the fears that there were about the mind being upset by the body. Now, the bicycle emerges in the late 1890s. This new piece of technology, it offers new levels of freedom to everybody, an ability to travel further, faster, on your own. It could offer independence. Think of the threat that that provides to the kind of model that we've built up there. You saw these amazing arguments occurring between medical practitioners within psychiatry itself about the possible damage that the bicycle would do to women's bodies and minds. I know that this probably sounds inconceivable to you now. The notion was that too much physical exercise would result in a degenerated nervous system, a degenerated reproductive system, right on cue. That's no, it happens every lecture. You saw people arguing about whether participating in the cycling craze would lead to women's minds being weakened because it was overstressing them physically, and this could lead to mental breakdown. As I say, these ideas were contested. They were contested by women and by some men, but there was still a dominant stream of thinking within medicine, within psychiatry, within society at large that saw something as simple as the bicycle as being dangerous to women's health because of the threat that it posed to what was regarded as the norm of femininity. It's worth now having a brief look at the at Showalter's periodisation, and I'll have to move on quite quickly as I'm beginning to run out of time. But obviously she places a particular emphasis upon the emergence of moral therapy in the early 19th century. And this should hardly surprise us when we think that moral therapy was aimed at the emotions in particular, the passions, those things that are outside of reason. So immediately you begin to focus on the moral, the affective. You're entering into the realms of women because in this model, women are more open to the influence of their passions. So clearly the emergence of moral therapy is very important in building and then reinforcing this dichotomy. And then, of course, we have our old friend Darwinism adding to the mix, the degeneration theory that comes on the back of it, and the way that this feeds into the construction of the female hysteric, which we briefly talked about before. She then goes on to suggest that in the period of modernism, the typical kind of figure of women and madness is the female schizophrenic. And of course, we will be going over a lot of this ground later on. You know, I've put this one lecture up on gender, but actually most of what follows is about gender. This one is specifically about women. The next one's about deviance, which will incorporate masturbation and a bit of homosexuality. The one following that is about shell shock, in particular about men breaking down in the context of the trenches, and how that fed into, how perceptions of gender fed into that. So that is a very gendered lecture as well. So we're going to see this increasingly over the next few lectures. And when we look at the anti-psychiatrists, we see the way that female schizophrenics were constructed by the oh-so-male gaze of R.D. Laing, of Ronnie Laing. So it is a very strong thesis. It's a very productive way to think about gender, but it's not unproblematic. One of the major problems with the thesis, and I don't think it's enough to demolish it, by the way, but it was the way she ran the numbers argument about there being more women in the asylums than men. Scull, putting on his sociologist hat, realised that it's not enough to talk about raw numbers, that we actually have to talk about relative numbers. And if we do a proper epidemiological study of the male-female imbalances according to age, but also according to the numbers within the wider population, we find that there is virtually no statistical difference between men and women admitted. The fact was, more women survived infancy, more women survived to become older than men. So there were more women in the population. So of course there were more in the asylums, but they weren't really overrepresented. I don't know, can we say that that's enough to knock the theory on the head? I'm not sure we can. It was just a bad argument, because we can't run away from the way that women and madness are represented in all of the different contexts that we've looked at. Nancy Tomes probably provides the best and most cogent critique of Showalter. Tomes herself is a feminist, so she's not coming at this from a kind of anti-feminist perspective. She's coming at it from the perspective of a good historian. She believed that Showalter had oversimplified 19th century medical arguments about which sex was more liable to insanity, pointing out that Anglo-American psychiatrists had a variety of compelling reasons not to give women precedence over men in this regard. And what she's pointing to are different forms, different expressions of madness, different ways that the different genders express madness. So men were more likely to suffer from the kind of nervousness that we've seen in the diseases of Charles Darwin or any of those other figures that suffered from nervous disease in the mid-19th century. These were public conditions as a result of the pace of life and the way that they lived. So, as Janet Oppenheim says in her work, it's utterly erroneous to assume that Victorian doctors perceived the male half of the human race as a paragon of health and vigour while assigning all forms of weakness to women. And then Mark Mikal dwells upon the issues that I've raised about the nature of the relationship between men and hysteria as well. I'm not going to read those out. I can put them up and you can have a look at them in your own time, or you can download the piece and have a look at Tomes's wider critique. And again, lots more text for you to get dug into. What I really feel about Showalter's thesis is that, notwithstanding these criticisms, there is most undoubtedly something behind it. It shouldn't surprise us that the way that people experience mental illness is structured through their experience of gender, particularly as gender is such a powerful kind of discourse that can structure the way that we act in the world. So it's unsurprising that while it might not be the female malady, women are perceived to experience mental illness in specifically different ways to men. The problem with Showalter is not how she describes the way that women and madness overlap, but the kind of assumption that there wasn't male forms of madness expressed through various aspects of manliness. But quite clearly it indicates that the way that psychiatrists operate in the world, the way that psychiatry, the minds of madness operate, has that capacity to reinforce and then further produce identities around things like gender.